So there's been a growing discussion lately about the iPad and how it's this incredibly powerful machine, and yet it's sort of being held back by iPad OS. The fact that Apple gave the iPad Pro the latest M4 chip, and yet it can't even make full use of it. And while this has been much of my experience using this iPad for the past week, throughout this experience, I've also realized that Apple sort of has an impossible problem to solve with the iPad. Let me explain. Oh, and make sure to get subscribed if you aren't already. Now, to sort of set the scene, most of these complaints are coming from Pro users. After all, if you're paying the Pro price tag for a Pro tablet with the Pro chip, it should be able to do all of the Pro things. So these are your video editors, your animators, your graphic designers, and even developers. But then on the other hand, you've got the 99% of casual iPad users who just need their iPad to do tablet things, like catch up on emails or watch their favorite shows and movies. People love the iPad for its simplicity. If you know how to use an iPhone, you probably know how to use an iPad. And I think Apple knows this, and they want to retain that experience for the 99% of casual users. But at the same time, I think Apple also understands that there's this growing community of actual Pro users who would really love to replace their laptops with an iPad. So the question is, how do we please both of these crowds? In 2022, Apple released Stage Manager for both Mac and iPad, a feature that I actually love and use daily on my MacBook Pro. And actually, in my experience, turning on Stage Manager on iPad OS really does, in a lot of ways, make me feel like I'm using a MacBook. Also, by plugging in a USB-C hub allows you to use external peripherals such as a display, external drive, and even a webcam. By attaching the Magic Keyboard, you also now get access to a cursor and a really nice keyboard with a function row. All of these things really start to blur the lines between macOS and iPadOS, and in my opinion, Apple's actually done a pretty good job retaining both the touch-based interface of the iPad as well as giving the Pro users a little bit more to work with. But really, the problems arise when you try to use Pro-level apps, which are really just dumbed-down versions of the desktop version. For example, Final Cut Pro for iPad and Premiere Rush. And during the week, I started to wonder, well, why can't these developers just port over the desktop version of the app to iPadOS? Is that really that difficult? However, it's not as simple as that, because fundamentally, iPadOS was developed as a touch-based system, whereas macOS was developed as a click-based system. Now, you might not have thought of this before, but there are some huge advantages with using a cursor over taps. With a cursor, you can precisely navigate to the exact pixel that you want to click, but with your fingers, inputs can be inaccurate. This results in the user interface on iPadOS generally being larger than the macOS counterparts. This is why to close an app on macOS, you simply have these 3 buttons in the top left, but on iPadOS, you have this more clunky 2-step process. In terms of apps, just look at the differences between Premiere on iPad and Premiere on Mac. On the iPad, buttons are generally much bigger to accommodate for the touch-based system, whereas on Mac, we get access to a bunch more tools and features. The same goes for Files versus Finder. On the Mac, you can clearly see that there is more functionality and you can fit way more information than on the iPad, because on the iPad, they have to make it touch compatible with our big pudgy fingers. But then possibly the biggest advantage of a click-based system is that you have 2 primary inputs, the left click and the right click. This basically doubles the functionality of the mouse because you're actually able to access contextual options. For example, in Photoshop, I can right click on a layer, which brings up tons of ways to modify that layer. And in Premiere, I can also right click a clip and do the same thing. Now, what happens when you right click on a layer in iPadOS on Photoshop? Well, nothing. And that's because as soon as you detach the Magic Keyboard from the iPad, you suddenly lose access to your cursor and, of course, the right click. Therefore, developers have to tuck those separate options and features elsewhere, which ends up being extremely inconvenient for the Pro user who's built up tons and tons of muscle memory for these applications. And so this is the impossible problem. Because on the one hand, on iPadOS, you have this really intuitive way of interacting with a device similar to an iPhone that 99% of users are completely fine with. But then on the other hand, you have all of the Pro users who would really benefit from something like a click-based system in which the current iPadOS is not. So what is the solution here? If we look at some other similar products, the Samsung Tab S9 Ultra is, well, first and foremost a tablet. But then with a shortcut, you can transform the tablet into this desktop-like experience with Samsung DeX. But then then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Microsoft Surface, which is first and foremost a laptop with the ability to sort of transform into a tablet. Now, I think this would be the equivalent of if Apple were to come out with a touchscreen MacBook, but then I feel like that would really start to blur the lines between Mac and iPad, and I feel like Apple wouldn't want to do that. So then the third and probably the most likely solution is Apple's gonna continue doing what they've been doing, which is adding more and more desktop-like features to iPadOS while still retaining that core iPad feel for those 99% of casual users. And for those of us expecting a huge change to come to iPadOS at WWDC, well, I don't think that's gonna happen. But hey, I could be wrong. Personally, I am part of the crew that would love to have a device like the iPad for doing those everyday tasks like watching my favorite shows, catching up on my emails with this beautiful tandem OLED display. But then when the Magic Keyboard goes on, I also wanna be able to do all of those same things that I do on my MacBook, like pro video editing. Is it too much to ask for, and is this wishful thinking? Who knows, maybe a dual boot iPad doesn't actually sound too bad. Make the screen bigger, maybe give us a 16-inch iPad and call it the MacPad. Everyone in favor of the MacPad, raise your hand. But yeah, let me know your thoughts down below. What could Apple do to solve this impossible problem? Subscribe if you aren't already, leave a like on your way out, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.